and CMP, Colorado Media Project. And we have Melissa Davis here so she can wave. And it's also a project of collab with Laura Frank. And you might hear a little bit more from them later, but it's really a project that organizes with community members inside and outside of newsrooms to ensure that journalism is creates a more informed, engaged, and equitable society. And so I'm gonna pass it over to Laura to talk a little bit about collab, and then I'll let you guys know what we'll be up to today.
Hi, everyone. I'm showing 52 people on this call, and that is exciting. And as Tina Griego, who's also with Collab, said a moment ago, it's so fantastic to see so many names that are not the same old names. So welcome, everyone. Thanks, Diamond. We at Collab, at the Colorado News Collaborative, are really excited to be involved in this project. It's a conversation that everyone feels very passionately about. And so Diamond is doing a great job at leading us in this. So thank you very much to Diamond and to Joe Torres, who is our guest of honor. And I'd also like to recognize two Collab board members, Polly Baca, if she could give a wave, who has a long history of fighting for equity in media, and Melissa Davis, who has a shorter history, but no less impressive in working toward strengthening the ecosystem for journalism in Colorado. So this is a really important part of that work. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you, Laura. And so before I give a little context about our agenda, I want to second all of Laura's sentiments. We're so glad that there are so many folks in the room. I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat as well. And we're so grateful to have Joe, who's a colleague of mine. We also have Christina here, Christina Pierce from Free Press. She's working on tech, so she'll be making sure that things run smoothly. If you have any problems, feel free to DM or message her and she can help you out with those. But I wanted to start with some guidelines. So just remember to be present in this space. If you need to move around and stretch, go off camera, feel free to do that. If you want to bring the kiddos or the dog in, I have a puppy that I'm sure will come over and knock these flowers over any minute now. Feel free to do that and go grab food, water, anything you need. If folks are on phone, go ahead and press *9 to raise your hand and *6 to mute and unmute yourself. And then finally, we did answer this question a little bit in the beginning, but we will be recording and we will send this recording out to folks after the event, to all folks that registered. So that won't record your small groups, which we'll be doing later, but it will record the presentation and the conversations at the beginning. So a little bit about why we're here. I know in the beginning we started with a little bit of slides that had to do with the history of Colorado, which is why we didn't have music. But we didn't start with those for me to be like a killjoy on your Friday afternoon, even though they definitely were heavy topics. But we really started with those because the first step to repair and reconciliation is acknowledging that a harm exists. And to be able to acknowledge that harm, we have to know that it exists. So that's what we're doing here today. We're here to learn about some of the lineage of the history of harm between Black communities and local news. And we're really going to work together to think about ways to address it and repair this history. And this really serves as a continuation of the work that we've been doing with CMP and their Real Talk conversations and News Voices reporting on a resistance. And what we heard at both of those events was a strong desire for journalists and community members to join conversations around repairing harm, expanding learning, especially on history, and co-creating solutions. It also serves as a precursor to our Black Voices Working Group, which we'll share a little bit more towards the end of this, as well as other opportunities to get involved. So a little bit on our agenda, we just ran through our guidelines and our introductions. So after I finish talking here, we're gonna talk with Joe Torres for about 30 minutes. After that, we'll have a 15-minute Q&A. And then afterwards, we're gonna break in small groups to continue building on what Joe and I talk about. And then after that, you're gonna do a share back with the larger group. We'll share ways to get involved, and then we'll all be enjoying our weekend after that, hopefully. So if that sounds good to everyone, I wanna go ahead and introduce my colleague, Joe, But before I bring him on the Zoom stage, I want to fangirl a little bit. So I work with Joe at Free Press, and Joe is author of News for All the People. And he's also a contributor to Media 2070. And it's just like a complete powerhouse, an encyclopedia. Any question you want an answer to, Joe probably knows that answer and a few more. But the discussion of his projects really visibilize the ways that the US system has taken part in state violence and harm against Black communities. But it also serves to begin thinking about a vision and a future where media has reconciled and repaired its historical harm with Black communities, which includes divesting from state violence and investing in narrative repair. We hope that this conversation with me and Joe will act as a thought partner for all of us as we reckon with the lineage around harm and thinks towards new and glorious futures. So Joe, you can go ahead and come off mute.
Yeah. How you doing, Diamond?
Good, how are you?
I'm good, I'm good. So, well, thanks for having me. I know we're going to talk a little bit about question, but I'm Joseph Torres, work at Free Press. I have a journalism background. I work for an advanced publication in Staten Island. It's still a daily paper, and it was a mid-sized paper in New York City. And then I went down to DC and I worked for, and I was the editor of, for a little bit, a publication called Hispanic Link Weekly Report, where I cover U.S. Hispanic politics out of DC. And it was really, it was really then that I started to really learn more about like issues of race and media, and just issues of race and media, but just also race in our society. Because as a college kid growing up in New York City, we didn't get taught this stuff, And when you enter the newsrooms, it's not like you learn from your own newspaper about what's going on with racism in society, including racism in the industry. And it's from there that I kind of feel like this. I work for the Hispanic Journalists Association. I work for Free Press, and honestly, I feel like my journey has been one trying to understand like who I am and what's my relationship to this country, and the idea of like Puerto Rican, and like what's my relationship to the country, and the idea of like how has issues of race and narrative impacted to me. I fight for racial justice through advocating for a better media system. And I truly believe, and we can get into it, Diamond, like if a multiracial democracy is going to be fully recognized and fully, if we're going to if a multiracial democracy be fully realized, because democracy hasn't been fully realized to this point, that we have to do something about narratives and our media system, because our media system very much shapes the public policies that are passed and the world that continues to be created every day, So, and anyway, we can get into what we were talking to Diamond, but the media companies and media system plays a direct role in the world we live in. So, a powerful role, So, but yeah, I know we're gonna have a little Q&A, so you want to do that's just my introduction of what my motivation for being here and just the work I do. Yeah.
No, thank you so much, Joe. That really just leads us into the first question around through all of your experiences and all the things that you've been learning, and a lot of the learning that you've been doing on your own, because like you said, it wasn't being taught to you. What have you learned really around the power of this narrative, and how has it changed your perspective, and how have you seen its impacts?
Well, when I was at the Hispanic Journalists Association in 2002, there was this effort for massive media consolidation during the Bush administration, FCC under Michael Powell, to allow one company to own, depending on the size of your market, the newspaper, numerous radio stations, numerous television stations, the cable outlet, the cable network itself, all in one market. And so we started to advocate that the racism that exists in media policy, because people of color don't own and control very little of the broadcast stations that exist. And the ultimate job promotion of a journalist is to be the owner, right? The editor, publisher will be the owner, right? And that's when we started to work on News for All the People. Juan Gonzalez is a great journalist from New York Daily News for a lot of years, and Democracy Now! And we worked on trying to understand the history of racism in our country, and we knew a little bit, but during the 8 years of researching this book, we learned so much more. In the book, we try to combine like the history of harm that media companies, media institutions have caused, and what's the function of narrative in our society, what are the function of so many media outlets in our society. And then on top of that, how was media policy created and how people of color were excluded from, owning and controlling their own platforms, right? So, and then with Media 2070, which, I'm honored to be able to work with the Black Caucus at Free Press in the creation and publishing of this essay we wrote. We all collectively wrote in October, and that released in October, and as a project is like to continue furthering that knowledge of like, I think when a lot of journalists, and y'all can correct me if you feel differently, but it's like, we don't know this history. It's not taught to us, this history of racism in the media or media policies and how they impact newsrooms and the owners of these institutions. I mean, we have just recently, the Los Angeles Times apologized last September for its history of racism. The Kansas City Star apologized in December for its history of racism, not just the history of racism in its publication, but was also actively promoting racism in our society. The Kansas City Star was actually promoting, the owner was in promotion of trying to segregate communities. We've had broadcast stations in the South that were openly opposed to integration, and so this reckoning happening right now is like, and how it needs to continue to happen, right? In order for us to be able to have a more just media system, and what we have now too, we have at a moment where journalism's in crisis, right? When it comes to the daily newspapers, where historically the most journalists have worked. And this is also effort right now in a lot of folks are unaware of in Congress to step in and try to save local journalism through federal funding, right? So potentially a new mechanism to continue to fund journalism is going to be maybe created on a local levels, and are we going to continue to repeat the harms, or can we create something new? And so, with the Media 2070 essay, we go in the news for all the people, but in Media 2070, we go back to the beginning. The very first continuous newspaper in our country was the Boston Newsletter, and in that publication, a month after it was founded, it started publishing ads for human trafficking, for the selling of enslaved Africans. A month afterwards, and during the early days of newspapers, the newspaper, right, the printer of the newspaper, who was often also the publisher, was engaged in human trafficking. They were the go-between between the buyer and the seller, right? And so, and there's evidence to show that Ben Franklin, who was the publisher of the Pennsylvania Gazette, was also a go-between between the buyer and the seller. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson put ads in newspapers to capture enslaved Africans who they enslaved, right? And also these ads in the paper of like runaway enslaved folks, right, were the first form of surveillance, really, of using the mass media as a surveillance tool. So the point is, like, from the very get-go, right, that lineage continues to this day of how mass media, and then continues to shape narrative, how narrative is shaped by Black folks, how media is used as a tool of surveillance still to this day, when with the online systems or newspapers were used as tool of surveillance to when it comes to lynching. And so there's been a number of media institutions over the past 20 years, the two most recently this year, that have apologized for its history of racism, including like the Hartford Courant, the Orlando Sentinel, the Montgomery Advertiser, that apologized in 2018 for its role in lynching for over a 70-80 year period. They're saying that we actively we helped to make this happen, like all the lynching that happened. So a little bit was happening over the past 20 years, and hopefully this will continue to happen because and I'll stop here. We can, let's stop here. I can keep going on this stuff, but it's like we have to reconcile this. This has to be reconciled. And what does the repair look like is a tougher question. But if we're going to be a multiracial democracy, and we have a media system where Black folks, and by extension, people of color, do not control the creation and distribution of their own narratives and their own platforms, it's not a recipe for a healthy democracy going forward. That's not a democracy going forward when you don't have the means to tell your own story. You have to go through gatekeepers all the time. So powerful gatekeepers. So I'll stop there.
No, that was a really important history for all of us in ways about the power of narrative and how it leads to policy, but also about the structures and the lineage that a lot of folks are stepping into. So what does it mean to step into a lineage that has this history? And what does it mean to understand your positionality in that lineage and that history? But as a part of that history, and I know Media 2070 talks about this too, but as a part of that history, we've also seen a lot of resistance. And we've seen a lot of creative responses to what's going on. So I definitely wanted to open the floor to Joe and Polly, because we have Polly as a special guest joining us, because Joe was telling us about some of the things that were going on in Colorado with the Community Relations Service and how we were able to get a coalition of Black and Latinx folks that were talking about these issues. And then kind of think about what does that mean about how long this has been working and what that means about changing systems.
Yeah, I love to ask Polly a question. Like the thing is, like, there's always been resistance in the. Freedom's Journal, the first Black newspaper, talked about we wish to plead our own cause, right? For too long, others from have spoken for us, right, babe? And newspapers like the Wilmington Daily Record, right, which was challenging white supremacy in Wilmington, North Carolina. The thing is, like, we saw all this insurrection happening in the Capitol. There was the only coup attempt, the only successful coup in our country of a local government happened in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, where the Raleigh News and Observer, the publisher of the paper, Josephus Daniels, was him and the chairman of the Democratic Party were the chief architects of the overthrow of the local government in 1898, because the local government in Wilmington, North Carolina was a fusion government. It was members of the Republican Party and Black folks. It was formed a fusion government, and so the Democratic Party at the time was the party of the Confederacy, and but the newspaper, right, played a critical role in its narratives to fomenting this violence. And then the Daily Record, the Black newspaper, challenged it, and they burned down the newspaper during the coup, after the successful coup attempts, right? They overthrew the local government and killed more than some folks, is up to like 40 Black folks in who were members of the city council and held all the different positions of power. And then Ida B. Wells' paper was destroyed. The paper in Oklahoma, Tulsa, Oklahoma, during the 1921 race, white supremacist riot was destroyed. Medgar Evers got on the airs in 1963 to challenge the racism of WLPT, a television station in Mississippi that was run. The general manager was a member of the White Citizens Council. He got on the air and made a speech for 17 minutes challenging the racism in that station, and people were afraid that he was going to get that he's putting his life in greater danger, because no one actually he would never appear on television, so people never really heard his voice before. And 3 weeks later, he was assassinated in less than a month later in his driveway. But from that case, from him challenging WLPT, there was an actual court challenge in 1966 by the local NAACP, another group in the United Church of Christ, against that racist station, WLPT. And for the first time, they talk about resistance, right? For the first time in US history, and the court ruled in 1966 that US citizens had a legal standing to challenge a broadcast license. Before 1966, a US citizen could not challenge a broadcast license even though broadcast stations used the public airwaves. But from then, all these license challenges started happening all over the country. And this is where Polly, right, where like was all over the country, Black and Latino folks were
Mhm.
challenging broadcast sites. It was an assault on the air, on the broadcasters. And
And
what's a little known history that continues to be uncut, that continues to need to be told, is the role of people like Polly and the Black Media Task Force in Colorado played in trying to democratize the airwaves in Colorado, right? So Polly, like, this is your history. This is the history you live.
well,
And
you know, it's interesting because you're referring to a time when we had the fairness doctrine, and the broadcast media had to uh, interview or had to bring us together as people of the community. So Blacks and Latinos, Mexican Americans, were, you know, the broadcast media were required to listen to us. And then we were able to organize. We put together the Colorado Mass Media Association of the Spanish speaking, you know, to try to organize the efforts to challenge broadcast licenses, because quite honestly, there was a lot of stereotyping. Early on, you know, we were trying to do something about images like the Frito Bandido and the you know, the sombrero under the cactus. You know, I mean, there were just a lot of negative images, you know, in the print media and in the broadcast media. So as early as, well, it was in the 1960s that we started to pull together, you know, small newspapers that were, you know, El Gallo and a lot of community newspapers, plus trying to get people on the air, but in an organized effort to challenge the media. And some of that was put together by what was called at that time the Southwest Council of La Raza, which later became the National Council of La Raza and is now Unidos. You know, but there were here in Colorado, up north, and probably in other communities too, there were, you know, there was segregation. Mexican Americans could only sit on the side aisles of churches or in the balconies of theaters. And in the newspapers, they would call some Latinos Spanish, you know, which was to make them feel like they were a little bit better, you know, Spanish American. And then others might be called Mexican American, or there were even the term spick was used. There were a lot of titles that were given to the community, depending upon who it was they were reporting on, that caused conflict in the community. And there's a whole history as to why some of the old families that had been here since before Colorado became a state, you know, were part of Mexico and part of Spain um, prior to 1848. Why some of the old families called themselves Spanish American as opposed to Mexican American, and it was really about how they were treated, you know, and how they were accepted. So there's a long history of problems in the media in the Southwest.
yeah, the thing that's really amazing that people, so the thing is, like, how do we, what's the role of government, right, in creating a new media, continue to ensure a media system is a just media system, right? And like the idea of we're fighting for media reparations, for the Black community because of the history of Black I mean, there's if you read our essay, we provide so many examples uh, um, to make the case, right? And there's a long history of the Black community fighting for media reparations. The first like known case of an actual successful effort for media for reparations was, I believe, in 1783. I think it's in the essay. Belinda Roy, I think her name was Belinda Royale. She challenged for pension when her the person who enslaved her died, and so and the long lineage happened. And today there's an effort. All the presidential candidates, Democratic presidential candidates, said they expressed reparations in some form or another, right? The study of at least. And so, with Polly, what was really interesting that it's not a well-known part of history is that that people know about, and when the media system is that when the 1964 Civil Rights Act passed, there was a creation of an agency within the DOJ called the Community Relations Service, and it still exists today. It's a group that the mediators are going to communities when there's tension, to behind the scenes to try to quell the tension happening. and they understood that they had to do something about the mass media in this country because of the racism that was happening in newspapers and television stations, and the reluctance to adhere to Brown versus Board of Education. They're like, folks were actively like, we're not using our media properties are going to be used to oppose integration. And so they started to hold conferences and teach activists how to file license challenges. This is the Department of Justice doing this. So they came to Colorado and they and held conferences and to bring the media institutions together with activists. So you can talk about, because you lived that history. Here's the federal government, and the federal government trying to understood that the media was a major problem to because of its racism, and they had to do something about it. And this was their effort. So you want to mention something about what they did in Colorado?
That was Manny Salinas and Leo Cardenas were both working for the community CRS, and it was an amazing time. They really helped us. We were trying to form we did form the National Chicano Media Association back in 1969, and it was based on the commitment to try to get better images in the media. And that's what Manny and Leo helped us with. And our the kingpin in all of that, the central figure in helping us do that, our leader was Ruben Salazar, who was the Los Angeles Times reporter at the time. And Ruben was also worked for KMEX, I think, in LA. But it was Ruben and I guess Leo and Manny, and at any rate, they were able to get a meeting with some of the top media people in New York. They had the national editor of the New York Times, the heads of the ABC, NBC, the networks, CBS, and the key people in the media. And there were about 15 of us that were invited to that meeting. And it was trying to challenge the media to change the way that they reported on us. And I remember Ruben saying, if you're not careful, there's going to be blood in the streets. And 3 months later, when Ruben was attending the National Chicano Moratorium against the Vietnam War on August the 29th of 1962, he was killed. And that was the same day that we had elected him the chair of the National Chicano Media Association. And I was elected secretary at the time, and it was a devastating blow to our efforts and our movement at the time. It was a lot of difficult history.
So, Diamond, if I can, I don't know how much time we have, but wanted to say, like, one of the inspirations for us to write Media 2070 was the fact that the racial reckoning obviously happening in our country, the reparations movement happening. There was a big hearing in 2019 that Ta-Nehisi Coates and others testified that received a lot of national news attention. But we named it Media 2070 because we hope by 2070 we'll have a different media system. It's like by then, when we have it in 1922, the Chicago Race Commission came out with a report on a study of the Chicago race riot in 1919. Right, in 1919, a famous Chicago race riot happened, and it was this Chicago Race Commission is the first. It's believed to be like the first true multiracial task force that studied that issued a report on race relations, and in it they had a whole section about the media's role in inciting the violence with its sensationals, with its coverage of of the Black community, and how it made people fear about violence, that the Black folks were a danger to society, and some of the recommendations is like, you talking about the slur they used in newspapers, Polly. They were saying like a lot of Chicago papers, please avoid using the N-word basically when you talk about Black folks. I'm saying? That's one of their recommendations, and So they had a series of recommendations about the media. They had analysis of the media harm. And then in 1968 is the famous Kerner Commission report, where they had a chapter devoted to the media's role in the racial uprisings that happened in 1967. And since, and that led to, obviously, in the, that is much more well-known history than like the history Polly's talking about, which all really contributing, which played a massive role in contributing to the diversification or the integration, if you want to say, the first real true mass integration effort of our nation's newsrooms, right? And so there's some local broadcasters who are who may still be on the air, who were on the air because of those efforts that happened almost 50 years ago, right? But so we have the Kerner Commission, and then we have the George Floyd uprising 50 years from now, and you see the uprisings happening in newsrooms. You have the New York Times fire its op-ed editor. The Philadelphia Inquirer editor resigned. The headline "Buildings Matters Too" in reference to the uprisings, and as I mentioned, the Los Angeles Times. In Colorado, there was a person who used to work for Colorado Public Radio who talked about his harmful experience. I believe his name is Lee Hill, right? Who worked in Colorado, who talked about like being the first Black person to work at Colorado Public Radio, and basically being so harmed by that experience that he doesn't want to. He stopped being an on-air reporter because of the experience he had there, being on air on NPR, on National Public Radio. Now he's a producer for WNYC, and then a lot of the idea that presence, like Rashad Robinson, Color Change often says, presence is in power. Representation is important, but having presence doesn't mean we actually have power. Real power is being able to change the rules, and so with Media 2070 is like we're trying to say that a debt is owed, right? This long history of anti-Black racism in our nation's media, a debt is owed, right? And so what is that debt? So we're trying to figure out, like, what is a policy platform? What is a platform for institutional and structural reparations, where institutions have to address the history of harm, not only address the history of harm, but how do you make the repair? So the harm is not only so the harm, not only you address the harm, but you ensure it doesn't continue to happen going forward. And then also with policy, how do you deal with structural racism? That the first Black owner of a radio station happened 20 years after radio was founded. Commercial radio was founded. So it's only 12 Black owners as of 2017 of full power television stations in this country out of more than 1,300 stations, right? And so the history, like, what is the cost of the history of exclusion? And then what is the cost of of narrative harm, right? And I just want to end by saying, like, there's a lot of great journalists, obviously, who work in newsrooms, and a lot of them on these calls. The point is, like, the lineage of anti-Black narrative, anti-Black racism, is just the history of this country, and that the media system that was created was not created like any other system, whether it's the education system or criminal justice system or any other system in our country, was not created to help Black folks and people of color by extension, And so all these institutions are like facing reckonings. And so it's like, how can we make sure our presence is power, right? And how do we have the power over our own institutions that we can have the ability to tell our own stories, and be well resourced to do that too, because we talked a little bit about Black press, but Black press has always been under resourced, and the Latino press. When we think about it's the same story. Even though Univision exists and Telemundo, those are not owned by Latinos. You know what I'm saying? Those are owned. Comcast owns Telemundo, for example. So I'll stop there. I know we got to probably get into a lot more questions, but just how can we create a media system where journalists can actually do the jobs that they were inspired to do, without putting the corporate interest, the corporate interest, is often working against the interest of journalism and serving the interest of the community, So it's a struggle for a lot. It's always been a struggle for journalists, you know, and especially in this corporate age. Even when the corporations were making a ton of money, newspapers especially were making a ton of money, had huge profit margins. It's always a struggle to be able to tell the story you want to tell, you know, because it's not set up that way often to actually get the best out of the folks who are trying to do that, who aspire to actually make sure their journalism serves a public good. So I'll stop there.
And I mean, I think that's the question of the day, the year, the decade, about like what are ways that we can create this journalism that we're talking about. And I think that's a really great note to really lead into questions. So I really want to thank Joe and Polly so much for all that history. And I really want folks to keep holding on to how do we continue to uncover this history, especially where we are. What are ways that we can do to verbalize this oral history, to share it and to learn more about it.
And I'd love to do another kind of session where it is like Polly and other folks who did this work, you know, because this history is not known. It's not ancient history. It just, you know, it's like an amazing media history that needs to be fully told, you know?
Totally agree. And we definitely have more room for more conversations like this. So I'm gonna go to the chat and folks can start putting your questions in the chat because we're entering our Q&A session. But we've got one in here from Tina. So I'll ask Tina to come off mute and you can ask your question.
I'm gonna find it in the chat. Am I still muted? I'm not. So before I ask my question, I'm doing a public service announcement for this book, News for All the People. If you have not read this book, really, I think this needs to be in all y'all's libraries, because a lot of the historic harm, a lot of the policy, a lot of the way that these things played out. There's a nice little section here about the Rocky Mountain News in Sand Creek. You know, this is really required reading if we're going to engage in a conversation that is grounded in our shared histories as members of the media. So buy it. All right. So I think my question was really related to, you know, this call to reckon with our past, to reckon with the past of the organizations that we've worked with, that we have written or broadcast for. I'm just curious about what you think, and Polly, I'm curious for you too, is what does a true, authentic reckoning or reconciliation look like? What does that encompass? And what are the barriers to that?
Well, in 2020, so the 2070 project, we're working this year on so reconciliation is doing definitely with stuff like the Kansas City Star and the Los Angeles Times has done, is really having a full acknowledging of the harm you caused. What the repair looks like is the tougher question, right? And it's because you don't want repair to be like diversity, equity, and inclusion, you know, because that's what they'll go to. Like the Washington Post, after this uprising's happening, they were like, okay, we're going to hire 12 you're going to have 12 basically positions that are really covering race. And it's like, this is what you should have done for the past 50 years. You know what I'm saying? It's like this Kerner Commission report is nothing new, as so many people on this call know. Like these conversations about race and what newsrooms should be doing, we've been having these conversations for a long time, right? But I mean, I personally think that, you know, we're talking about the role of narrative has historically upheld a white racial hierarchy, right? It's played a critical role in upholding hierarchy in our society, a white racial hierarchy that also exists in our newsrooms, you know? And so that's what we're working on in 2021 and 2021. Part of the media reparations team is what is repair, right? And repair obviously can look different for every community, but what does repair look like? How do you know is reparations has been achieved? I'll give you one example of something as a reparations effort that's really interesting, that perhaps we can learn from it, and this is what we're trying to do too, and apply to me. And so this year we're working with our cohort of coalition partners to develop a platform on media reparations. So it could provide some guidance to what folks can do. But an example we're inspired by, it was happening in Evanston, Illinois, where the city council passed a reparation, the passage of a reparations fund. And what they're doing is, because of the history of harm done by the drug, policing and like the arrest of Black folks in the community over drug offenses, right? So-called drug offenses, right? And now the cannabis is like legalized, and so they put a tax on cannabis, right? And that tax is going into a reparations fund. And that fund is going to fund up to $25,000 of any Black resident who lived in Evanston from a certain period of time. They have a criteria to put a down payment on a home, right? So that's a way in which trying to use something that where it was, even though Black folks made up 70% of the population of Evanston, made up 70% of the rest, right? Drug arrest, like how to financially, help to build wealth in the community where wealth was extracted because of racist policing and policies, basically. So like there's examples like that like exist, right? And there, for instance, in something that, as far as I know, has never been acted upon in Wilmington, Illinois, Wilmington, North Carolina, there was a commission that came out in 2006 about what happened of the uprising, the coup. And they talked about the harm, they talked about how Black media was harmed and how white media institutions have to study about the harm that was caused to Black newspapers, right? And so they don't go into it, but it's like, what is the history of harm of like, that's happened in our society to Black institutions like Black newspapers, because of the history of racism, and including by white media institutions. In that case, in Wilmington, North Carolina, the paper got burned down. And matter of fact, the editor of the paper was in fear for his life for years afterwards, because folks in Wilmington were tracking him because he was very vocal against the racism that was happening in that city prior to the 1898 coup. So we're learning from these kind of efforts, and we have a cohort of activists and journalists and media movement journalists, and talking with folks who are in the reparations effort, that they are, like the National African American Reparations Commission, to come up with a framework that we can suggest for people to think about when it comes to media. So yeah, so we're working on that. So that's to come, but the acknowledgement has to happen, because with the acknowledgement, then you can understand like what is the repair that needs to happen. But without acknowledgement, it's harder to understand the repair. So I'll stop there. So Polly.
I think you said that very well, Joe, and I agree with what you said. The other part of all of this is I've always been concerned about the stereotyping of any ethnic or racial group, because there are differences. There are as great of differences within each group as there are between the groups. And so I sometimes think that the media needs to listen more and recognize that people are unique, and there are, within each group, there are voices and people from many different perspectives, and have different experiences, and contribute in many different ways.
Yeah. I am so grateful for this conversation and your question, Tina, because these are hard answers. And I would second with Joe. The Media 2070 team is really leaving a platform about solutions open to folks most impacted. And so I think what Joe says, and I think it's like a mantra of the Media 2070 team is what is the cost of this harm? So what does it mean to find out the cost of the harm, whether it's cultural, structural, political? Once we start listening, like Polly said, and understanding the extent of the harm, then folks that are most impacted can lead what repair to those harms looks like. So I really appreciate that question. And yes, you can follow up. Or I don't know if you're waving.
I do have a quick follow-up. Yeah, so one of the things I wonder about though is that, are we having this conversation solely in the context of what happened in the past? When we're talking about reparation, we're talking about past harm. And so what I wonder is if in framing it that way, we leave room, and this is a follow-up question in the chat that I had, was we leave room for saying that happened then. We were causing this damage then. And how do we continue to acknowledge the ongoing, more subtle, insidious harm that's being perpetrated now? And it may be a function of just ignorance, right? A lack of education. It may be a function of, how newsrooms are structured and not the simple, checking the boxes. But that's one of the things I wonder about when I hear these conversations, is that I worry sometimes that the conversation and the acknowledgement of past harm, which is necessary, somehow provides an out to have an equally hard conversation about ongoing harm.
I'm glad you said that. I didn't do a good enough job of saying like we don't see this as a past harm. We see like what's happening, like the racial reckoning that is happening today is the product of everything that's came before. That's the system we have today is that's the way you said, like racism could be overt, but it can be very insidious, right? And people have more, there's a whole bunch of ways in which you can use your narrative and your platform to harm people, but have political cover, let's say, right? I'm just trying to find a better word for it, but it's not like you can claim deniability, like no, you're not being racist and stuff like that. And your choices, who you hire, what stories you tell, what stories you don't tell, how you frame stories. Like there's so many ways, right? But it's like we're not we talk and that's why the reckoning happening today is saying like this is still happening today. Like this is like that's why what's really it's I don't think there's been really a period of history where so many journalists have throughout the country have been speaking out as forcefully as they have so publicly and taking on their institutions so publicly, like Wes Lowry, and I mean there's so many folks doing it in newsrooms across the country who may not get the headlines. What happened at the Pittsburgh paper, with the so there's a lot of the Black caucus at the Los Angeles Times, and then the Latino caucus of the Los Angeles Times after that, right? Really spoke up forcefully about like how their newsrooms are underrepresented, how they're marginalized, how the voices of journalists are being totally marginalized in these institutions in ways that we don't get to see publicly, but they were airing it out, right? And so no, this harm very much continues to this day because these companies are a product of like everything that's come before. They still function with the same kind of like upholding a hierarchy, a white racial hierarchy. And so I totally agree with you. This is not like something you did in 1930 that doesn't have. It's like yes, you have to address that too, right? You have to address because that's part of the harm. That's like if you're Kansas City and you help to played a role, the paper in creating the segregated society that's still segregated. The harm comes up to the present day. It's like the harm continues. The harm in the past doesn't just live in the past. The harm in the past also is reflective of the society we have today that you helped to shape. And so is the media institutions. And this is why since the Kerner Commission, we're still fighting the same story. It's still the same kind of issues that we're still advocating for when there was this first really true wave of like trying to integrate our institutions. And the American Society of Newspaper Editors continued to fail on achieving parity, as they say, and stopped even doing the study because newspapers were not even contributing to the study anymore. So they said, we're not gonna even do it anymore. You know, we're gonna come kind of with a new mechanism. The harm continues, you know? So, but it is insidious in a way which these examples are so overt, right? And by the way, I'm getting, like, the sun's going down here, so I'm gonna have to turn on the light in a second. And so now I agree with you. And then we talk about, like, you know, in television for a second, you know, when Les Moonves says his famous quote that Donald Trump might be bad for CBS, but he's good. It may be bad for America, but he's good for CBS. Now, I'm not trying to take a political position here, but, you know, if I'll just say that the guy, you know, he was saying that Donald Trump is basically terrible, you know, maybe bad for this country, but he's doing great for the profit margin of CBS. Or when Jeff Zucker compares his ratings in CNN, saying it's like sports talk radio. This is how we program CNN, like sports talk. You know, it's like, and then you saw in a recent tape that came out, he wanted to, you know, Donald Trump lost that election in 2016. He wanted to offer him a program, you know? And so it's like racism is racism has been good for business, you know, for these guys, you know what I'm saying? It's been a good business model, because it's like, just like Facebook, and we talk about Facebook and Twitter, when you incite people, you know, you bring back, you get a lot of viewers, right? The amplification of hate and all that, like, gets people to really charge people up to continue to visit your site. But and so we talk about that too. We talk about also, like, social media companies as well have to be a part of this equation, because they are shaping narrative, you know. So I agree with you, Tina. And last thing I say, because I'm talking too much now, is like, we don't want to be prescriptive on, like, say this ought to be the solutions without being in community, you know. So we wanted to work within community to collectively come up with a position on reparations platform that includes, like, how to do institutional structural racism. We wanted to do it within the community in a thoughtful way, and not be like, here we are, Free Press, telling you where reparations is. So that's why we're taking our time with it. I'll stop there. And turn on the light.
Thank you so much, Joe and Polly. We're about to head into our small group so that we can talk about this a little bit more with each other. But I wanted to leave any room for any last thoughts from Joe or Polly. And then before we go, we're going to go ahead and take a screenshot of the group. So while we're getting any last thoughts, maybe grab something fun that's next to you, a book on your office, a dog, a cat, anything.
You know, it occurred to me when Joe was speaking that, you know, the media has been so much top down. Whereas if you take a look at what just happened this past week or this past month, you know, the intelligence comes from people being able to, or CIA, you know, FBI operatives, or someone being able to go within the group to learn what's going on. And maybe the media ought to be thinking about, how do you really report on people? Well, it's by becoming a part of, walking in their shoes, you know, being a part of whatever might be going on. And I'd sure like some thoughts about that, because how can you report on anyone if you just see it from the top down? You're seeing it from a bird's eye point of view, as opposed to being from within. And so if you really want to know what's going on with it in a particular group, you need to be walk in those shoes and have some reporters that are part of the group.
That's a really good point, Polly. And I just want to give Diamond and her team a shout out, because that is a real expertise that Free Press has, really working with journalists to take a community organizing approach to journalism. So if you're interested in that, you can always reach out to Diamond.
Yes, and I'll be sharing our contact information. And like we said earlier, we'll be sharing folks' emails and contact information at the end. And if you don't want your information shared, feel free to keep DMing Laura. But if folks could grab your animal, object, anything, Christina, the lovely Christina, is about to take screenshots. And it looks like there's 3 pages for me. So just she'll say 1, 2, 3, and you pose for each one.
All righty. Can you all hear me? Okay. All righty. So get ready, and I will do a 3, 2, 1, and then we'll all smile, and I'll take the screenshot. All righty. 1, 2, 3. Okay, one more. 1, 2, 3. Smile. Yay! Everyone looks so cute. All righty. I think I got everyone.
Awesome. Thank you, Christina. I'm sorry, my dog just got let out, so she's trying to jump up here. I'm going to start sharing my screen so that we can go into our small groups. But as I'm doing that, I'm going to introduce kind of what we're going to be doing next, which is a small group activity. So you'll be in about groups of 5 for 30 minutes, and you'll be answering 2 questions for us. So with those 2 questions, we're going to ask just a little bit of a debrief around how do you feel after hearing that presentation? I always press share instead of present. How do you feel after that presentation? What does it make you feel? What were the things that surprised you? And then the second question, which we really want folks to focus on, is how do we begin to repair and address these past harms and active? I want to emphasize that because of Tina's questions. Distrust that is a result of the ruptured relationships between Black communities and newsrooms, specifically here in Colorado. So on the right side, we've got some examples here to get you started. But yeah, like I said, we've got 30 minutes. So maybe take about 10 minutes for the first question and really spend the 20 minutes, the bulk of your time, on question number 2. And really think about the more concrete the solutions, the better. So think of things that are cultural, structural, internal to newsrooms and reporting, external to newsrooms. And if your group is having some trouble getting started, the way that we like to think about it a lot is, how would you begin to repair a relationship with a friend or a family member that is ruptured? What were the steps that you would take there to really rebuild that trust? And so we're gonna have about 10 groups, and we've got about 7 facilitators. So if you're in a group without a facilitator, just make sure you assign someone that's a timekeeper and someone that's a note taker. So the timekeeper will just make sure that everybody, that we have enough time to get to all those questions. And then the note taker, if you could take notes, you'll be sending them back to me at the end of the presentation. And if you volunteer to be the note taker, you'll also most likely be the person that's doing the share back. And since we have so many groups, we'll just do a popcorn share back, so not everyone will have to go. But that's what we'll do. And I think Christina is about to break us up into groups now. Popcorning. We've got, let's see. We've got about 10 minutes or so for share backs because we want to make sure we get everybody out on time. So we're looking to hear from about 3 groups. And don't forget, if you are the note taker and you are taking notes, you can go ahead and send those to me and I'll drop my email in the chat. But anyone feel free to come off mute.
I can speak for our group. We talked about a lot of issues actually, but the main things that we wanted to bring to everyone's attention is the idea of community journalism. And we talked about that in a couple of different contexts. So like Joe said earlier, a lot of times journalism can be top down. And so we thought about ideas like having people from the community be able to in some way report on their own community, especially if your news station, your news entity doesn't have a journalist who's part of that community and sort of within the community able to report from the inside out. And then we also talked about an idea of having articles that were published by your news source, having the community review them and make annotations and then republishing those annotations so that the rest of the community and other communities can read what they think about this article about them. And then the other thing that we covered is that a lot of times the stories we give on any given community are what we as journalists see. And it's very, very important to get the perspective of what that community wants the rest of the world to see about them. So we talked about doing things like surveys, asking them what they want. A lot of times it's all negative coverage, and they want to see a lot more positive things rather than just the problems happening. So that was one big takeaway, was ways to involve the community. And with that, we talked about reviewing archives for harm. And Jake brought up the Boston Globe, how they're having an application to review their archives so that if there was something published in the past that is harming you now, especially like in terms of reputation and getting jobs and things like that, you can put in this application to have it removed or updated or supplemented to say, you know, this person has paid their dues to society. And we talked about how traditionally we as journalists save, especially in the newspaper industry, saved those things as sort of unalterable, and they are the way they are, and you can't change them, you can't do anything to them because they're this record. And we talked about how maybe now that that's sort of changing a little bit, where you can start to annotate those things and relook at them and acknowledge what harm they caused in the past and what harm they're causing now, and find ways to make it clear how we can not let these past archives be causing current harm. So those were our big takeaways.
That's amazing to be able to cover all those topics and have concrete action steps in 30 minutes. Shout out to your group. Does anyone want to go and share from their group?
Yeah, I will from our group, just because I think it ties into something that was just said there. We were talking about actionables to what could news organizations could do to repair maybe what they're doing now. We did talk about acknowledgement. One of the issues that came up was, we know what happens. We know what the LA Times apologized. We know the Kansas City Star did. I haven't yet seen a news organization in Colorado do it. So we did start off our discussion talking about to what extent we believe that might be possible and where that might even happen. And one member of the group said, I don't think it would happen. I think she said, I don't think it would happen in this market for some reason. I would guess I would wonder why. When it comes to immediate repair, I mentioned something that goes to what Anna just said there. Crime coverage, I think, is really different depending on news organizations. Some think about it differently and are forward-thinking, progressive thinking about this kind of issue, and some news organizations just completely aren't, and it's obvious, and the disparity is pretty stark. And I wondered what kind of accountability there might be for that. Who or what entity in Colorado is willing to say, stop publishing mugshot galleries because it's wrong, and who can really speak for the journalistic community in Colorado when it comes to that. So those were a couple of the things that we discussed as well.
It's really interesting, and I will drop a link in the chat, but one of my colleagues that's like the same version of me in Philly is actually working on that exact project. So in Philly, their whole News Voices is focused on crime coverage, and they're trying to build a coalition now of organizations, and they're really thinking of themselves as like the watchdog around this. So I'll share that so folks can look into that more. Does one more group want to share?
I can share with mine. Realizing that we're the group of three of us have all different experiences within journalism, going from just a few years in Colorado to having decades-long experience. So we've seen different ways of how our newsrooms have been shaped around, and how different attitudes have been promoted, from being able to write in a way that anyone can read it, but then it becomes less reflective of what your community becomes. and not talking about race within the newsroom when you have an opportunity of having people of different races, ethnicities, and backgrounds. And also we talked about sort of like self-reflecting of what our coverage is, like what type of images we are putting out there for our audiences, and if it's useful, is because what you're putting out there is what you're saying, is what you're saying you see people as, whereas people see themselves in different ways, and we should be sort of reflecting on those same wavelengths. And lastly, we talked about hiring different people for journalism. If you're seeing that everybody looks the same, what are you not? How are you not reaching out to other people? Or if people are saying that your coverage is too white, what does that mean? Are you not reaching out for all of your community? And that can be going into social media, looking at different hashtags. I mentioned one of Rainy Day Jobs from April Rain, who is the creator of the hashtag Oscars So White, and how much just that hashtag brought so much change into Hollywood. She's doing that for a lot of media jobs. So like if you have a job in your news organization and you want more people of color to join in, just put on that hashtag when you post it on Twitter. And that's going to go to even more people. And then she sometimes promotes it. Some other people do, and it'll be on other hashtags. So that's going to be, I mean, that's like free recruitment right there, you know, that you don't have to pay for. But that's, those were things that we were looking at.
What was the hashtag again?
Rainy Days, REI. I'll put it in the chat, but it's REIGNY days. Rainy Day Jobs. So sorry, I can't spell today. That's really it.
It's okay, it's Friday. Thank you so much. And I know I said 3 groups, but that was just in case we ran out of time. So there's one more group. Any final thoughts that people have, or just burning things that you want to share?
Okay, I will talk briefly about our group. We kind of strayed a little bit, meandered around the various topics. One of the things that I was saying that I personally was surprised with was that media organizations had been apologizing for these past harms. I haven't seen any of those, and so now I need to go do some research and see what has been done and what they own up to. We were also talking about how media harm has been done, not just to Blacks, but all kinds of minorities. Polly was in my group, so we were talking about how Hispanics have been reported on in various newspapers. And in her case, her family was very familiar with a newspaper in Greeley at the time. And a lot of times it was even segregating those within the minority group that were accomplished and successful from those who, you know, were not as successful by, let's call it white society or mainstream society standards, and how that would be used to I don't know, judge or separate people and continue, I think, although we didn't say this in our discussion, but I think continue to oppress those who were not succeeding. We didn't really come up with any solutions, but I know that there are discussions like this that are not only happening within the journalism community, but also between the journalism community and the general public. And I think this kind of a topic should always be a part of those discussions. So it's not just what should we cover that the public is not seeing us cover, but perhaps more about how should we cover it, and where are we falling short in our coverage, and maybe having uneven coverage or discrimination in our coverage. And that's all I can contribute at this point.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a perfect segue to some of the stuff that we'll be working on to kind of get at more of these questions of answering what news do Black Coloradans want? What information needs aren't being met? What are ways that Black Coloradans and newsrooms, as well as other institutions, can strengthen this information sharing system for Black Coloradans? So let me share my screen really quickly. Okay. So CMP Collab and News Voices Colorado, we're looking to launch a Black Voices working group along with other working groups to follow after this one, starting in late February. And we're really going to be focusing on how do we improve access to trustworthy news and information that accurately reflects the realities, narratives, and objectives of Black Coloradans. So what we're hoping to do with this group is gather Black leaders throughout the state, Black journalists with various forms of power within newsrooms to really talk about what are ways that we can move forward, what are ways that we can address these harms that are past, that are ongoing, and what kind of systems and practices can we put in place to address them and begin reconciliation, especially to center the stories and experiences of Black Coloradans. So what it looks like, you're already at part of it. The one newsroom workshop, that's a part of it. And then we'll be having 3 90-minute working group sessions starting in late February, like I said. And a lot of the guiding questions that we're going to be asking are, what already exists in the Colorado ecosystem that can be used to create stronger systems, like I said? What do Black Coloradans want to see? What stories do they want to hear? And what are the steps? What are concrete steps that we can put in place to begin ensuring that these recommendations come to fruition? And News Voices Colorado, me, CMP, and Laura at the Colorado News Collaborative, we're going to be a part of the team that's going to make sure that once these recommendations for structural, cultural shifts and changes continue to be brought back up, continue to be moved. So we're going to take charge of being part of those people that hold those. And as a part of the Black Voices Working Group, we're also going to formulate, based off of the wishes of the people in the working group, a white accountability working group. And they will work after the end of this working group, along with Melissa, some of my colleagues probably at Free Press, Mike, and all of the other partners to also do their work to help implement these, because we want to make sure that the labor isn't just falling on the folks in the Black working group to make sure that these implements and these changes are seen. And we're going to send out a survey. Christina's going to drop it in the chat right now, but we'll also send it to your email where you can get more information about these working groups. And you can also think about other ways to engage on advancing equity work, and think about ways to continue with the conversations of News Voices Colorado. If you want more conversations like this, if you want more panels, you'll be able to get all that information and share that with us in the chat. And I see a question in the audience from RevQ, so I'll pause there and stop for questions.
I just have a quick comment, but it's after your was amazing, and I don't want to take away from that. So if anybody has a direct question for you, I would yield my time. I just have a comment I would like to say after that.
Hey, Rev, I think we don't have enough internet connection. It might be, I think you might be in the car. So I don't think we were able to hear that question. But if you can hear me and you can type it in the chat.
Are you able to hear me?
No, we can't really. It's really broken up. Are you able to type it in the chat and I can say it out loud for everyone? I think we lost Rev, but I'll make sure to loop back and I'll share the question with everyone if it was a question for the greater group. But that's kind of what we had for the News Voices working group. And the reason that we really wanted to start working on this is so that we can meet the needs of Black Coloradans as a method to make local news truly sustainable, equitable, and of service to the Black community, especially because of what we learned today, where particularly and historically Black community members have not reaped the full benefits of news as an information sharing system, as a community connector. And like I said earlier, we listened to folks at the Real Talk Journalism Talks or Real Talk Conversations with Colorado Media Project and Reporting Resistance with News Voices Colorado. And they talked about journalists having a lack of meaningful connections with BIPOC communities and the urgent need to build trust and undo harm by telling the stories and joining conversations like this one around harm. And community members in Reporting on Resistance also talked about this need to really build relationships and strong and trusting ones between them and their local news sources. So we're hoping that these working groups can serve as a continuation of these conversations that we've had, of the things that we've been hearing, and of the reckonings that we've been talking about this summer. So like I said, Christina's gonna drop that in the chat. And the one ask that we have of you is that you share this working group. We'll share the brief with you in the follow-up email, but you share this working group brief with Black community leaders that you think would be a good fit for this working group, and that would be able to provide concrete recommendations about how we can start serving the news and information needs of Black Coloradans. And since we have a little bit of time, we've got about 6 minutes, I'm going to drop a question for you all in the chat that's also on the survey. But it's going to be about what's one commitment that you can make that you're going to do in either your organizing, your reporting, or your newsroom that's going to move one step towards equity. And so once you drop that in the chat, one of the survey questions is also if you want to have an accountability buddy. And if you click that, we'll be able to match you with folks that also want an accountability buddy, and you guys can meet, talk about the challenges, about what's going well, and just continue to think about how are you implementing this in your work. Thanks, Christina. Love Christina. So I'll just sit here and wait for folks as you guys are throwing that in the chat. And just I can't think of the word because it's Friday, but some of your responses, we will hopefully be taking and putting them into a Padlet as like a visual resource for folks to look at, including some of your responses from the registration questions on Eventbrite. But I really want to thank you all so much for joining us and sharing so much of your thoughts and your creativity and spending this Friday with us on a very interesting week. I'm sure folks had a lot of anxiety this week, but I really appreciate you all being here. And I'll turn it over to Melissa and Laura for any last words.
Yeah, thank you, Diamond. Thank you so much. This has just been a really, and Joe, thank you for sharing so much really important history with us. We're just really humbled by you both being here and sharing that really important history. And all of you that joined and stuck with us till the end, really appreciate your time. And we really hope that you'll join us in the continued conversation and be a part of the solutions with us. So thank you for being here.
I will just echo what Melissa said and really appreciate each and every one of you and the job you're doing to help make journalism stronger and make communities stronger and try to right some of the wrongs that have been done. So I just, I'm in awe of all of you. Thanks very much for this. And a special thanks to Diamond and to Joe and to Polly.
Yeah, I'm gonna try and see if I can turn out some elevator Friday walking out music while folks keep putting their stuff in the chat. But thank you all so much for joining us. And yes, thank you so much to Christina. She's on the East Coast, so it's dark there, but I really appreciate you.
Yeah, enjoy your weekend.
Have a good weekend,
Diamond, are we?